I grew up in a bright red brick house in Richmond, Virginia, a place people often slowed down to admire on their evening walks. The house sat on a quiet tree-lined street where the sidewalks stayed warm long after sunset in the summer. When sunlight hit the brick walls, the color glowed like something out of an old family postcard. My parents, Margaret and Henry Walsh, always bragged about how they built everything with their own hands, which sounded impressive to anyone who didn't know the truth. The truth was quieter, tucked deep in my bank statements, hidden inside the late-night payments I made without being asked and without receiving a single thanks. For almost 5 years, I covered nearly every bill that kept that lovely red brick home standing. I paid the mortgage. I spent the insurance. I repaired the roof when a storm cracked the shingles along the back edge. I covered the water heater replacement when it failed in the dead of winter. I sent about $2,400 a month and told myself it was temporary. By the time I finally added up the totals, I had paid almost $142,000. Not once did anyone ask how I managed it. Not once did they ask how these payments affected my own life. It was as if helping them was my entire identity, and I was expected to play the role without complaint. My twin sister, Amelia, was the pride and joy of the family. She had the smile everyone adored, the bright laugh people compared to sunshine, and the charm that won her trophies, praise, and endless attention. She was given an all-expenses-paid trip across Europe for graduation. I was handed a $10 coffee shop card taped to a note that said, "Gratitude makes life richer." They said it like it was a precious lesson, as if they were teaching me something deep about life. Everyone laughed and clapped for the cute little moment. No one saw my hands tighten or the sting I felt behind my ribs. There had always been a pattern. Amelia sparkled. I supported. She was celebrated. I was steady and invisible. Whenever relatives visited, they stood proudly in front of framed photos of Amelia posing with medals or standing in front of some school achievement. I was always in the background, often blurry, sometimes cropped out entirely. They loved the idea of a perfect daughter and a quiet daughter, and Amelia fit the first role while I was sorted into the second without a choice. I told myself for years that maybe this was normal. Maybe love was uneven in every family. Some parents overwater one flower and forget the others in the shade. Maybe I should accept my place and be grateful for the chance to help. But over time, those thoughts grew heavier. I started noticing the small things, like how my mother's face brightened for Amelia's smallest stories but stayed flat when I talked about my job or my goals. Or how my father proudly introduced Amelia to neighbors, but stumbled through a vague sentence when introducing me. The weight of being unseen became more tiring than any bill I paid. One summer afternoon, everything inside me shifted. My parents were in the living room, both smiling at Amelia like she was the center of their world. They showed her the European itinerary, complete with hotel stays, first-class flights, and tours across France and Italy. I knew the price of that trip. I knew it down to the last detail. I also knew that I had just paid the utility bill the week before, using money I had planned to save for myself. My mother handed Amelia a printed folder filled with plans and receipts, and the way they all laughed together felt like a script. A script I was never given a part in. I stood there for a long moment, watching the scene as if I wasn't part of it. It wasn't jealousy. It was awareness. A bright, uncomfortable awareness that the story I had been living in was not mine. I wasn't the daughter of this house. I was the scaffolding holding up everyone else's comfort. The emotional support beam. The silent provider. Later that night, I walked out to the front porch and sat on the old wooden steps. The air was thick and warm, and the cicadas hummed in the trees like they were trying to tell me something. I hugged my knees and looked at the house I had kept standing for years. In the darkness, the bright red brick looked almost black. It struck me that I didn't recognize the home anymore. It wasn't a place of comfort. It was a structure I paid for without being welcomed into. I made one quiet decision. One that felt so small yet so life-changing. I decided I would not keep paying for a house where I was treated like a visitor. A place where my efforts were invisible and my worth measured only by what I could provide. I didn't announce it. I didn't hint at it. I didn't argue or explain. I simply stopped making the payments. I stopped being the one who always stepped up. I stopped being the person who patched the cracks no one else saw. It was the first time in years I chose myself. And that decision, that single act of silence, was the first stone that made everything begin to crumble. The first month after I stopped sending the payment was strangely quiet. I half expected a text from my mother asking why the mortgage hadn't gone through, or a call from my father pretending he was just checking in when he really wanted to question me about the bills. But nothing came. Not a word. They must have assumed the bank glitched or that I updated my card and forgot to tell them. They always trusted I would fix things. No one imagined I'd ever choose myself over the house. They believed I was too reliable, too steady, too soft. By the time the second month arrived, the silence turned sharp. One humid afternoon, my mother showed up at my small apartment without warning. She didn't knock gently or wait for me to open the door. She pounded so hard the windows rattled. When I finally let her in, she shoved a wrinkled notice into my hands. The red letters glared up at me. Past due. She looked furious, almost offended, like I had broken a promise she never asked me to make but always expected me to fulfill. "What is this supposed to mean?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the room. "Why would you put us through this?" Her tone wasn't confused. It wasn't worried. It was accusatory, as if I had committed a betrayal. I stared at the notice, then at her. There were 1,000 things I could have said. I could have reminded her of the years I paid, without complaint, the money I poured into that house while they complimented Amelia's accomplishments like she was keeping the lights on. I could have pointed out the truth they refused to acknowledge. But I was tired. Truly tired. "I can't be the only adult in that house," I finally said. She blinked at me like she didn't understand the words, or didn't want to. "Your sister is under pressure. You know that. She needs support. You know she struggles." She said it with such conviction that it made my stomach tighten. She had turned Amelia's comfort into a family project and my responsibility into a lifelong duty. I almost laughed, not out of humor but disbelief. Amelia struggled with small things, but she never struggled with the things that mattered because she never had to. Everything was placed in front of her, often with a ribbon. I was the one who patched the cracks and filled the gaps. My mother stood in the middle of my apartment, surrounded by my worn secondhand furniture, acting like I had committed a crime. "I'm not doing this anymore," I said, softer this time. She shook her head, her face tightening with frustration. "This is childish. This is selfish. Your father and I are dealing with enough already." I stayed silent. Not because I didn't have answers, but because arguing with someone committed to misunderstanding you is like shouting into a locked room. All it does is exhaust you. She stormed out moments later, her footsteps echoing down the hall. When the door finally shut, the silence left behind felt heavier than anything she said. The next few weeks unfolded like a slow unraveling. First came the cold texts, then the guilt messages. Then the calls were timed at odd hours, so I would feel cornered. Amelia joined in, too, her messages dripping with condescension. "So this is your big moment," she wrote. "You want to make a statement. You could have just talked to Mom instead of doing this dramatic thing." I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in explaining myself to someone who had spent her entire life believing the world owed her comfort. She had never once asked if I was okay. She had never wondered how I managed to keep everything running. In her mind, my silence had always been agreement. The third missed payment arrived, and that was when panic replaced anger. My father started calling relatives to ask for help. He made it sound like a temporary financial hiccup, a small issue they needed assistance with. But my cousin Emily, who had always been smarter than people gave her credit for, asked the question my parents hoped no one would ask. "Why do you need a loan when your other daughter always handles the house payments?" 5 seconds. That was all it took for the truth I kept hidden for years to spill into group chats, texts, and family threads. My phone lit up like a Christmas tree. "You paid their mortgage. For how long? Why didn't you say anything? Are you serious?" My parents tried to control the narrative. They sent their own messages, trying to paint me as dramatic or unstable. They insisted they helped me more than I helped them. They implied I misunderstood how families worked. But the more they talked, the more the cracks in their story widened. Too many relatives had borrowed money from me before. Too many people knew I never exaggerated. And too many remembered moments when my parents bragged about supporting both daughters equally, even though that had never been true. Their perfect image started to crumble. The red brick house that once symbolized stability turned into a symbol of all the secrets buried inside it. The cheerful posts they once shared online about family unity now looked staged. The polished stories they told about fairness sounded hollow. For the first time, people saw the truth. The applause that once surrounded Amelia faded. The admiration that followed my parents dimmed. The polished facade cracked open like a dropped ornament. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel vindicated. I simply felt free. The truth had finally stepped into the light, and I didn't have to push it there. Everything they built on image, on performance, on selective affection, started to collapse under its own weight. All from one quiet decision. All from choosing myself once. Moving to Philadelphia felt like stepping into a world that finally had air I could breathe. I arrived in late spring, when the trees along Benjamin Franklin Parkway were still heavy with blossoms and the evenings held a soft warmth. I rented a small beige townhouse near Fairmount Park, nothing fancy, but clean and quiet and entirely mine. The rent was manageable on my new marketing salary of $85,000 a year, and for the first time in a long time, every dollar I earned went toward creating a life instead of holding one together. The townhouse had creaky floors and narrow windows, but I loved it from the moment I opened the door. It had a tiny kitchen with white cabinets that needed a fresh coat of paint, a living room with sunlight that stretched across the hardwood every morning, and a bedroom just big enough for a queen-sized bed and a modest dresser. I bought each piece of furniture slowly, one paycheck at a time, choosing things that felt warm and simple rather than practical and expected. For once, I didn't ask myself if something was worth it. If it made my space feel like home, that was enough. I also bought myself a used silver SUV for $18,000, paid in full with my savings. I had never owned a car that wasn't shared, borrowed, or judged by my family. Sitting in the driver's seat for the first time, hands on the steering wheel, engine humming under me, I felt a quiet pride rise in my chest. I wasn't relying on anyone. I wasn't being taken from. I was building. Those early months were quiet in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. I would wake up to soft morning light, make coffee in my tiny kitchen, and sit at the small table by the window watching people walk their dogs through the neighborhood. No one demanded anything from me. No one complained. No one expected me to solve their emergencies before taking care of my own. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. Work became its own kind of refuge. The office was in a renovated brick building in the center of the city, filled with people who didn't know my family history or the weight I had carried for years. They saw me as a coworker, not a caretaker. They valued my ideas, my focus, and my reliability. For the first time, I wasn't the person doing invisible work. I was recognized, respected, and even praised. I didn't realize how starved I had been for simple acknowledgement until I felt it land on me like sunlight. Outside of work, I began to build a life that didn't revolve around crisis management. I took evening walks through Fairmount Park, letting the green pathways unwind whatever stress lingered from the day. I tried new restaurants and let myself order dessert without guilt. I visited local thrift shops and bought a soft navy sweater that became my favorite thing to wear. I found a quiet bookstore on a corner downtown and started spending entire Saturday mornings there, flipping through pages without checking my phone. The more I allowed myself to live, the more I realized how much of my life back home had been survival. I had been so consumed by responsibility that I forgot what actual freedom felt like. And as I built routines in Philadelphia, healing came not in dramatic bursts, but in steady, gentle waves. Like breathing evenly for the first time after holding my breath for hours. I started freelancing in the evenings, one small project at a time. I didn't need the extra income, but it felt good to work for myself on the side. By the end of the first year, I had saved nearly $12,000. I remember staring at my bank statement one night, stunned. Not because I had the money, but because none of it had disappeared into someone else's crisis. On my birthday, I walked into a little jewelry shop on Walnut Street and bought myself a delicate diamond necklace for $250. It wasn't big or flashy. It was simple and lovely, and the act of buying something for myself without a second thought felt like reclaiming a piece of my identity I had lost. A gift with no hidden message, no guilt attached, no whispered lesson disguised as generosity. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I would sit in my living room with a cup of tea, letting the warm glow of my lamp settle over the room. My thoughts drifted back to the red brick house I once kept standing with my own hands and money. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a distant ache that slowly faded as months turned into something steadier. That chapter had closed, not with a dramatic ending, but with a quiet exit. I didn't leave in rage. I left in truth. Every so often, I wondered whether they missed me, or if they only missed what I provided. But the thought didn't pull me back. Instead, it reminded me why I needed this space, this distance, this independence. I learned that stepping away from a place that demanded more than it ever gave wasn't abandonment. It was choosing a life where I could exist fully. Philadelphia gave me room. Room to breathe, to rebuild, to understand myself beyond obligation. Room to feel joy without guilt. Room to rest without being labeled lazy. Room to grow without being overshadowed by someone else's shine. By the end of that first year, I had formed a quiet but solid truth inside myself. I didn't need applause. I didn't need acknowledgement. I didn't need my family to see my worth for it to exist. Peace was enough. And I had finally found it. A year passed before anything changed. I had settled into my life in Philadelphia, waking up each morning without the familiar weight of someone else's emergency waiting for me. My days were filled with quiet routines, new friendships, long walks through Fairmount Park, and the slow construction of a life that felt sturdy in ways I never imagined. I thought the past would stay behind me, tucked into the shadows of the red brick house I once held up with my own hands. But healing rarely moves in straight lines. Sometimes it circles back, knocks gently, and waits to see if you will answer. The first message came from Amelia. It was a long text, the kind she never used to send. I remember opening it in my kitchen after a long day at work. The early evening sun was casting warm light across the counter, and for a moment, I wondered if my eyes were playing tricks on me. Amelia had never been one for vulnerability. She preferred quick, light messages that made her sound breezy and untouched by consequences. But this message was different. Heavy, thoughtful, almost uncertain. "I didn't know," she wrote. "I didn't see what you were carrying. I should have treated you better." She went on to say that losing the safety net she had taken for granted forced her to grow up. She admitted she had been selfish, that she ignored everything that didn't benefit her, that she only saw what she wanted to see. She said the silence between us had changed her, softened her edges, made her reflect. And then she wrote the words I never expected from her. "I miss you." I read the message twice, then 3 times. I didn't feel anger or triumph. I felt something quieter, like a window that had been stuck shut for years had finally cracked open. Not enough for fresh air to flood in, but enough for a faint breeze. I sat down on the edge of my sofa, the phone warm in my hand. For years, I had imagined what I would say if she ever apologized. In my mind, the words were sharp, full of honesty and years of swallowed pain. But now, face to face with the apology, my heart didn't want to reopen old wounds. I didn't want to hold on to the bitterness. I didn't want to start from the beginning as if none of the years had happened. I wanted peace. So I replied with 4 simple words. "I wish you well." It was not forgiveness. It was not a promise of reunion. It was a release for both of us. 2 weeks later, my mother called from a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. Not weak, but humbled. "We never realized how much we leaned on you," she said slowly. "We're sorry." There was no dramatic speech. No excuses. Just a quiet confession wrapped in regret. She sounded older, as if the truth had aged her. For a moment, I imagined her sitting in the living room of the red brick house I once paid for, her hands folded in her lap, finally seeing the cracks she had ignored for so long. I didn't cry. I didn't break. I simply listened. "It hurt you," she said. "We know that now." I nodded, though she couldn't see it. The ache that once filled my chest didn't swell. Instead, it loosened. It didn't undo the years of imbalance or erase the wounds that shaped me, but it softened the sharp edges of memory. We spoke for a few minutes more. Pleasant, cautious, like two people stepping into unfamiliar territory. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time, letting the weight of the past settle into a place where it could no longer reach me. The apology didn't rebuild anything, but it closed a door inside me that had stayed cracked open for too long. I finally understood that the red brick house was no longer mine to worry about. Whether it stood or fell was no longer tied to my identity. My parents would figure it out. Amelia would find her own footing, and I didn't need to carry the structure on my shoulders anymore. Walking away had not been betrayal. It had been self-preservation, a chance to step out of the shadows and into my own life. Months later, I accepted a transfer to Chicago for a better position and salary. The move offered a fresh start, and the city opened itself to me with long lakefront trails, bright city lights, and neighborhoods filled with the hum of possibility. I bought a small gray stone home on the south side for $260,000. It had a deep porch, tall windows, and a tiny yard where I planted flowers each spring. The house wasn't extravagant. It didn't need to be. It was warm, steady, and mine. On quiet evenings, I would sit on the porch steps with a warm drink, watching the neighborhood settle into the soft blue of dusk. Kids played on the sidewalks. Neighbors waved as they walked their dogs. The breeze carried hints of fresh-cut grass and the faint smell of someone cooking dinner a few houses down. It was simple. It was unhurried. It was peaceful. Sometimes I thought of that red brick house in Richmond. Not with longing, not with anger, just with distance. It felt like a chapter from a book I had lived long ago, a story with pages smudged from too much turning. A place where I once buried myself to keep others standing. Now, my life no longer revolves around holding anything up. I was building, growing, living. I felt safe. I felt seen. And most of all, I felt free. I learned that sometimes loving yourself means walking away from the places that teach you to disappear. And once you choose yourself, no apology, no memory, and no past can undo the freedom that follows. Walking away didn't save the house I left behind. It saved me